By the 15th century, the English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch had arrived on the continent of Africa, drawn by the discovery of gold. In 1441, Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese prince, left the African coast with another export: 12 men and women held in chains. His ship bound for the New World would mark the beginning of what would become 400 years of terror for generation after generation of African people, a journey that would come to be known as the Middle Passage.
Well, the Middle Passage was the middle leg of the slave trade. Ships would leave Europe or America loaded with rum, guns, cloth, and other items which they took to Africa, traded for the slaves, picked up a load of slaves, and then brought them to the Americas.
The nation would often trade its human captives for European trinkets. Cheap goods poured into Africa, replacing the African-made products and the people who made them, systematically destroying the African culture. As Africa continued to be economically torn apart, the European powers continued to prosper. It became big business. The Royal African Company was chartered to represent the commercial interests of the English crown, trading goods for slaves in West Africa and transporting those slaves for sale in the New World.
You have to recognize that the slave trade was really based on power and economics. It was for the benefit both of the Westerners and for some Africans. Wars were perpetuated, tribal wars, because of the slave trade. Those in power were the ones that captured and sold slaves. And in doing this, they disrupted the family. One of the most tragic things about the slave trade is what it did to the family.
Stop! Ugly, hateful men! Stop! My father is coming! Oh, cruel ones! Please don't take me. See, I'll be good.
They were chained. A device was placed around their necks, so if they escaped in the jungle, they get tangled up. They were marched overland to the coast, just simply by force.
After being captured, stolen from their homes and communities, Africans were forced to travel from the interior of Africa to the west coast. The journey could cover 500 miles and take up to 8 months.
Slaves are commonly secured by putting the right leg of one and the left of another into the same pair of fetters. By supporting the fetters with a string, they can walk, though very slowly. Every 4 slaves are likewise fastened together by the necks with a strong rope or twisted thongs, and in the night an additional pair of fetters is put on their hands, and sometimes a light iron chain passed around their necks. Mungo Park, British explorer.
Coming down from the interior to the coast, I mean, nobody's made any provisions for food or for the comfort of these people. People who are unable to make the journey, who get sick or become weak and unable to move on, are left to die.
While I was with his enemies in the camp, I saw a child of about 18 months old cast out of the camp because the child was so young that nobody would buy him. That poor orphan was there crying at the point of death for about 2 days, and none took pity to pick him up. Joseph Wright, former African captive.
No matter what happens, they are certainly ill-treated physically, they're certainly ill-treated psychologically and so forth, because they're taken from their homes, taken to a place they know not where. They don't have a clue as to what is going to happen to them. And they have all these images that must have been going through their minds about being eaten perhaps, or whatever else may happen to them. And so these are things that are immeasurable. You cannot tell how bad this treatment is.
On the coast were the castles, more than 50 of them, financed by European slave trading companies like the British Royal African Company, the Danish West India Company, and the Bank of Amsterdam. These large fortresses were built into the cliffs and served as living quarters for the European traders and government officials, and temporary prisons for millions of Africans. Some still stand along the coast of what is now Ghana, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, Benin, Togo, and Gambia. Today, they're known as points of no return.
The logins and apartments within the castle are very large and well built of brick, a massive airless dungeon. It will conveniently contain 1,000 blacks. The keeping of the slaves thus underground is a good security against any insurrection. Jean Barbeau, slaver.
I took a smelly place. It's like, where did the slaves sleep? Where did they go to the bathroom? How long did they stay here? Why were they sold? Why did they do this to them? They're relevant questions that only a child can ask.
They weren't loaded directly onto the ship. There were factories on the coast. The Africans were sold to these people, and then they sold them to the ships. And this was an economic enterprise.
One day, the white men arrived in ships with wings, which shone in the sun like knives. From that day, the whites brought us nothing but wars and miseries. Oral history from Pende tribe.
Most of the Africans who were brought from the interior had not seen white men until they reached there, and they were afraid of white men. And for some reason, they seemed, most of them, to get the idea that the white man was a cannibal, and they were taken to be killed and eaten.
The blacks were all stripped naked and shipped by 2s and 3s in canoes through the surf. They are so willful and loath to leave their own country that they have often leaped out of the canoes, boat, and ship into the sea and kept underwater till they were drowned to avoid being taken up and saved by our boats, which pursued them. Thomas Phillips, slave ship captain.
This is a place that is taking away people. So it strikes terror in you. It's not just the physical slave trade, it's the terror that people feel when they see the approach of these vessels. So there's tremendous fear as to what these ships represent.
Wednesday, June 12th, buried a man slave, number 84, of flux, which he'd been struggling with near 7 weeks. Thursday, June 13th, this morning buried a woman slave, number 47. Know not what to say she died of. She'd not been properly alive since she first came on board. Monday, June 24th, buried a slave boy, number 158, and a girl, number 172. Captain John Wheaton's logbook.
The exact number of Africans captured and delivered to the New World will probably never be known. It has been estimated that 15 million Africans began the journey to the United States, South America, and the Caribbean, and of those, at least 2 out of every 10 died at sea.
The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. Olaudah Equiano, former African captive. I cannot see my home, my country. Where did they take my people? Who will take care of me down there?
To meet the demand of having to transport human cargo, ships had to be redesigned. Tight packers held up to 1,000 captives, seated below deck with no space between them. Loose packers carried approximately 250 captives, locked in a prone position, arranged on wooden racks 6 feet long and 1 foot wide. The average length of the journey was 8 weeks.
We heard the moans, cries, and rumblings coming from below, and as soon as the captain and crew were removed, the hatches had been taken off, when there arose a hot blast, sickening and overpowering. In the hold were 300 or 400 human beings. gasping and struggling for breath. Some were stiffened in the most unnatural positions. J. Taylor Wood, Anti-Slavery Squadron.
Early slave ships did not provide ventilation for the crowded conditions below.
If you look at some of the surgeons who worked on some of these slave ships, they'll tell you how hot it got in some of these slave holes, that sometimes the candles that the surgeons used to see in the holes often would not burn because there was not enough oxygen.
It is an unbearable situation. And when you speak about it, even the visual doesn't do it. You've got to get the smell.
The slave ships had names like Brotherhood, John the Baptist, Justice and Integrity, Gift of God, Liberty, and Jesus. The crews came from around the world, men and boys.
These people were scared to death. They were stripped of dignity and stripped physically and put on board ship. They didn't know where they were going, what their future was going to be. They were treated like animals, really like animals. They were a product, a piece of merchandise.
You hear stories, of course, of women who took their babies and threw them across the heads of other enslaved people to get to the food and to the trough where they were fed, sometimes like hogs in a trough. And they would throw the babies over the heads of the other people, you know, just so the babies could get something to eat.
Down my cheeks the tears are dripping. Broken is my heart with grief. Mangled my poor flesh with whipping. Come, kind death, and bring relief.
Disease was a relentless killer. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, and scurvy consumed the ships.
The floor of their rooms was so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. Alexander Falconbridge, slave ship surgeon.
If indeed someone got sick with smallpox, which was incurable at the time, you simply tossed the person over. And if you suspected that it spread to others, you tossed these people over.
Abundance of these poor creatures are lost on board ships merely through the surgeon's ignorance, because he knows not what they are afflicted with, but supposing it to be a fever, bleeds and purges or vomits them, and so casts them into an incurable diarrhea. And in a few days they become a feast for some hungry shark. Dr. T. Aubrey, slave ship surgeon.
During the Atlantic slave trade, the population and migratory practices of the Atlantic sharks changed dramatically. Sharks followed the slave ships for hundreds of miles across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. The Atlantic slave trade became profitable in life and death by creating an opportunity for rising insurance companies. Lloyd's of London, originally a coffee house, began to build a financial powerhouse by insuring British slave ships and their cargoes.
The insurer takes upon him the risk of the loss, capture, and death of slaves, or any other unavoidable accident to them. But natural death is always understood to be expected. By natural death is meant not only when it happens by disease or sickness, but also when the captive destroys himself through despair, which often happens. But when slaves were killed or thrown into the sea in order to quell an insurrection on their part, then the insurers must answer. Insurance Law 1781.
For a large number of Africans, suicide was preferable to slavery.
I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. The crew used to watch us very closely, and I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so. Olaudah Equiano, former African captive.
They felt that if they could get away and jump ship, they could return home. But if they didn't get back, it's all right, because their souls would be saved and they would join their ancestors in another world.